Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're tuning into this episode. We are a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we really appreciate you listening, watching on YouTube. We really encourage you to subscribe to whatever platform you're using. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, or if you're on Apple or however you listen to a podcast, be sure and subscribe. We greatly appreciate it. Also, make comments if you like it and share it if you like it. We really need people to make comments and share the episodes that you like. And then also, if you're not already a supporter, we really would encourage you to go to spiritualityadventures.com and you can pick a tier, and we have bonus content for every type of giver. This is a nonprofit, so they're tax-deductible donations, but we do provide bonus content for those who are supporters. So be a part of the team, help support Spirituality Adventures, and we're so glad you're tuning into this episode. All right, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. Glad you're tuning into this episode. I'm excited to introduce you, if you haven't already met her or run across, Paula Stone Williams. Paula, thank you for joining Spirituality Adventures.
It's good to be with you today.
Yeah, so I was talking to our common friend Doug Padgett, and I was telling him that I was getting ready to do a podcast interview with two of one's a current congregation member, and one that was a previous congregation member with two people I've pastored who are now trans women, and I was going to bring them on together, and we were going to talk about what we thought about this and what we were thinking in the 90s, and then all the different ways we've changed and transitioned and all this from just the way we think about this issue to their personal stories as well. And Doug was like, well, you got to talk to Paula Stone Williams. And so I was like, okay, because I think we've interviewed one Black hip hop artist who's a trans man. And that was a really interesting conversation. But thank you so much for joining this. I read your book, As a Woman. Your memoir came out in 2021. And what an amazing story. Oh my gosh. There were times when I was tearing up. There were times when I was laughing. There were times when I was just feeling the tension of all the things that you've gone through in your life, especially when it got to the family, telling your kids and all this kind of stuff. And oh my gosh. So thank you for putting yourself out there like you've done, sharing your story and helping us who don't understand this world so well. I feel like I'm an ally with the queer community, but still learning and growing myself so much as I hang out with people.
Thank you. Yeah, the book has done very well. I was fortunate to get a contract with Simon & Schuster, and fortunately had a very, very good editor. So working on a proposal for another one right now that, not saying much about it at this point, but also could be another TED Talk, which is a possibility. I don't write or speak much on trans issues any longer. My first TED Talk was on gender equity, and now I speak all over the world on issues related to gender equity, and very rarely speak on trans issues. I'm also very active in the TED world, and serve as a speakers coach for corporate speakers and for people who do TED Talks. And then I also am mayor pro tem of the town I live in here in Colorado. And actually, the fact that I'm trans is incidental in almost all the worlds I inhabit now, which I am very fortunate and probably one of very few in the trans world that has had that kind of privilege of it not being the main thing that people think of when they think of the person, at least not any longer. Certainly it was that way when I first transitioned, having been an evangelical leader.
Yeah, let's give a little background on that for the audience. You tell us about the family that you grew up in, the evangelical world, and how that. Give us, like, where did you grow up? Was your dad a pastor? Is that?
Yeah, my father was a pastor, and I grew up in the Stone Campbell movement in the Independent Christian Church, which there are about 7,000 churches nationwide. A cousin of the Disciples, cousin of the non-instrumental Churches of Christ. And one of the largest denominations when it comes to mega churches and also in church planting. In fact, 4 entities within the independent Christian churches started and owned the Exponential Conference in its early days. I have no idea if they still own it now, but I was the CEO of one of those 4 organizations. I was the CEO of a very large church planting organization that was New York based, but worked throughout the United States, Northern Europe, and Northern Asia when I was still with them. And yeah, also I preach pretty regularly in mega churches. I think at some point I've preached in 3 of the 10 largest churches in the United States. I was in the regular preaching team of a couple of mega churches. So all of that stopped within literally 24 hours when I came out as trans.
Yeah. How long ago was that? What year did you come out?
That was 11 years ago.
Okay. I did my Doctor of Ministry at Fuller Seminary with Peter Wagner with missiology and church planting stuff, and planted a vineyard church in Kansas City.
Yep. Well, that's because you and I are both older than dirt, you see. And so we actually go back to those days. I was out there a lot in the 80s for things with the Fuller Institute as well as the seminary. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, let's see here, you're with the Independent Christian. So I'm now I have full standing with the Disciples of Christ.
Yeah.
Pastoring an open and affirming congregation in Kansas City now. So I had to do all the history of the Stone Campbell movement, right? And all
right. Well, that's where the stone in my name comes from. Is Barton W. Stone is on my family tree. So, I come in, and my dad's mother was baptized at Brush Run Creek, which is where the Campbells established a church. So, yeah, I am about as deep in the roots of the Restoration movement as one can be.
Wow. I went to my first Disciple of Christ national convention last year in the summer, and it was in Louisville, Kentucky. So, so they had a bus trip, to the, anyway.
Yeah, I've actually spoken at the meeting house at Cane Ridge when the Independent Christian Church Convention was held in Louisville, and we took a bus trip over there. Yeah, because I was editor-at-large of their national magazine at the time, the Christian Standard.
Interesting. There was a guy that planted an independent Christian church in Kansas City. I think he was sent out by a huge Chicago mega church that's independent Christian.
Yeah, it's one.
Troy McMahon?
Mm-hmm, yeah, I know Troy.
Okay.
Yeah, the Chicago organization was one of the 4 that owned the Exponential Conference, the New Thing Network. Mm-hmm. One was a church, Centerville Christian Church in Centerville, Virginia. One was Stadia Church Planting Organization, which was the largest within our denomination in California. And one was the Orchard Group, which was the organization that I was CEO of and then chairman of, which was New York based. So yeah, we worked pretty closely with those guys. I actually am a pastoral counselor. My doctorate's in pastoral counseling, and I actually have 2 clients right now, 2 that come out of New Thing Network backgrounds. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So when Troy moved to Kansas City to start the church, he had his core group coming to my Sunday night service until they planted Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, so I was talking to somebody this weekend at the Mountain Film Festival in Telluride, and we were with Doug Padgett and a bunch of other folks. And I was telling them, it wasn't Troy, but I have another friend in Kansas City several months ago who just preached a sermon. One of these, like, hey, we love everybody, and it was one of these messages where, the gay community is committing suicide because that's a sinful choice, and therefore they're feeling shame over their choices. Literally, just within the last year, after all the kind of research that's going on. So, a part of me is like trying to help my evangelical friends that I've hung out with for decades to introduce people like you and hopefully hear and listen to stories. And I know you've been previously doing this. You've had these conversations with people so many times. Give us a little window into what your book is great. You go through many chapters on how you entered into adolescence late, how you always were sensing you were always sensing you describe your experience as you were living as a man, identified as a man at birth, but always felt like a woman. That's actually
not correct.
Okay.
That is the typical narrative for trans people. But as I said in my first TED Talk, if you've met one trans person, you've met exactly one trans person. So every story is unique. I never felt that I was a woman in a man's body. I felt like I was supposed to have been born a woman. And I felt like a man in a man's body, but it did not feel at all like home. It felt like a foreign location. And so I think I was, in fact, in pretty much every way, behaved as a male and had thoughts and feelings that males do. Testosterone is a pretty powerful substance. So is estrogen, by the way. But I had this strong nagging sense from the time I can first remember that I was not supposed to be a boy. So as I say in my TED Talk, I thought that a gender fairy would arrive and say, what gender do you want to be? And I think that came out of both naivete and white male entitlement. But then when a gender fairy didn't arrive, I didn't hate being a boy. I just knew I wasn't supposed to be one. And so it wasn't until it got to the point that I could no longer survive living as a male that I finally came out. I wanted to get all the way through my life without transitioning because I did not want to do that to my wife or my children.
And when you were doing all the work with the Independent Christian Church, and then you met your wife in college, married, you have 3 children, is that right?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
3 children. And how old were your kids when you finally came out to them?
I came out in 2012 to them, and they were born in 77, 79, and 80. So you can do the math on that one. It was very difficult for all of them, particularly for Jonathan. Jonathan wrote about it eloquently in his book, She's My Dad, which was published by Westminster John Knox in 2018. Jonathan and I did a TED Talk together and have spoken all over the country together on how difficult it was for him to come to grips with my transition. All of that's pretty easily findable on the internet. The TED Talk is the shortest version of it all, 14 minutes. That we did at TED Women in 2018.
And you and your wife had been processing this before you talked about it with your kids for several years. Is that correct?
From the time we were married, yes.
You were processing all of
this. Yeah, she and my therapist were the 2 people who knew. No one else on earth knew it all. Yeah.
And you were in New York, making a living, speaking all over the country, doing church planting conferences, talking about this with your wife, and finally the tension got high enough in you that you decided to come out to your kids. You did that, and then ultimately came out to your staff, right? To your board?
Correct. And though I'd been with the organization 35 years, though I had taken them from a budget of $160,000 to $4 million, though I had never had a bad review, I was gone in 24 hours. They also pulled my pension, which would have been worth about $1 million. They also did not want to give me back $500,000 I had directed to them as a loan. That was my money. and had to threaten a lawsuit to get that back. So it was not a particularly pleasant departure.
So your children, or who were adult children when you came out, basically, right? Mm-hmm. They were adults. I think, if I remember, your daughter processed it more quickly. Is that the right way?
Both daughters were very supported very quickly. All of them have had to go through their time of pulling away and figuring things out. Jonathan was the first to do that, but all three are very supportive. We're a very close family now. But it'll never be the same as it was before. Families are gendered. And so when someone transitions genders, it is very difficult for the family process. My son and I just got back from a week of hiking in Scotland, northern Scotland, and it was just an absolutely wonderful trip for us. And I think it was, in a lot of ways, kind of a full circle healing for us, 11 years after the fact of coming out and transitioning. So it takes a long time, I think, for a family to work through that. It's also, I think I avoided doing this as long as I could because of what it would do to my family. And sure enough, I'm glad that I did avoid it. And if I could have avoided it my whole life, I would have, because it was, in fact, devastating for the family.
So you've done TED Talks now on this topic, or on...
Not on this topic. No, I speak on gender equity because one of the things that I discovered is that life is far, far easier for men than it is for women. I am very, very fortunate as a trans woman in that nobody in the world seems to know that I'm trans. And so that means the world receives me as a woman pretty much 100% of the time. And so I experience life in the same way that cisgender women experience it. And it is far, far, far more difficult as a woman than it was as a man. And so my first TED Talks had 7 million views, and I've heard from women on all 7 continents thanking me for validating their experience. Unfortunately, every time I speak on the subject, which I will be actually later on today, I always don't have to dig into my files for illustrations. I have them from that very week, always. It is, in fact, a world tilted in favor of males. And males just don't know that. All they've ever known is being a male. There's no way they can fully understand it. Really, even women, because that's all they've ever known, can't really fully understand how much the world is tilted in the favor of men.
Yeah, so I'm curious, do you feel like in the evangelical world that you inhabited, have you seen people change their minds over the course of the last 11 years that you've come out and you've shared your story?
No, not at all. In fact, it's moving in the opposite direction. The numbers get worse and worse.
Give us some statistics around that.
87% of evangelicals believe gender is immutably determined at birth. 67% believe we already give too many civil rights to transgender people, and yet only 31% know someone who's out as a transgender person. If we take a look at the 592 laws introduced in state legislatures last year, the 90 that were signed into law in 22 different states, it was not, in fact, Republicans who were driving those laws. In fact, 2 significant studies show 61% of Republicans feel that transgender people should have the same civil rights as anybody else. But it is Republican legislatures that are passing these laws. So what is driving that? It is evangelical Christians who are driving that. So the fact that the evangelical community has moved in the opposite direction, those numbers have gotten worse and worse. The most recent study went 84% to 87%, 61% to 67%, even though the numbers of people who know someone is transgender actually grew from 25% to 31%. But that was just in a 3-year time period that we see those numbers increase. So there's no question that the evangelical community has been driving the force against transgender people, and in fact has been extremely vocal and very mean-spirited toward me. Last Thanksgiving, I got 15 texts in the morning telling me that I should not exist on the face of the earth because apparently 15 people had nothing better to do on Thanksgiving morning. Because I'm a very public and high profile figure, I've been able to protect myself from that stuff. But these people have done their work to figure out that there's a particular way you can send a text that a phone might block it, but if you have an Apple computer, it will not block it. And so that's how they communicate their anger toward me. And it takes a lot of work to figure that out. And that has been almost 100% coming from the evangelical community.
Wow. Is it because I've heard, I was just interviewing Tom Ord and his daughter, Alexis Ord, who is in the queer community, but Tom's a Nazarene guy who wrote a book called Why the Church of the Nazarene Should Be Fully LGBTQ plus affirming. And he's now facing a tribunal for it. Anyway, he was sharing, if you go back, I don't know how far, I mean, most evangelicals would have been against even gay marriage, right? I mean, back when Rick Warren was trying to, do the California proposition against gay marriage.
The numbers on that still, 51% of evangelicals, 51% of millennial evangelicals are supportive of marriage equality in the last study that was done on that subject, which I believe is 2019. And that was up from 36% the previous study. But yes, it is evangelicals, Christians that still are the lowest percentage, actually the absolute lowest at 15% are Jehovah's Witnesses. Evangelicals on the whole, only 36% are supportive of marriage equality if you look at all the age groups. And take a look at the Roman Catholic Church, 51% are supportive of marriage equality. Of course, it's not a democracy, so particularly the U.S. Catholic bishops are not supportive of it. You look at the mainline Protestant churches, on average, 2/3 of them are supportive of marriage equality. Take a look at the more liberal Jewish denominations, and over 80% are supportive of marriage equality.
So that one is moving, in a positive direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the trans discrimination is moving the opposite way.
Right, and the reason for that is actually a reason that I think anthropologically and sociologically they have to look at, and it's also why I don't take things personally. If you take a look at the work of E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, who was a sociobiologist at Harvard and MIT, who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. His first Pulitzer Prize was in identifying that the key social unit for the human species was not the nuclear family, it was the tribe. That we are a tribal species. And interestingly, as Jonathan Haidt notes in The Righteous Mind, we never took off as a species when we were at the level of blood kin. We did not take off as a species until we got to the level of tribe. What brought us together to tribe, to be at tribal levels? And most people assume it was our need for safety, and it's not. What brought our species together into tribes was man's search for meaning. So think Stonehenge, or the carved bodies of Rapa Nui, or the burial mounds of indigenous Americans. So ultimately, I believe religion is good for our species. I think it's always been good. I think it always will be good. It's the place where we figure out the meaning of life in community. And so I, as well as others, am alarmed at the fact that we've gone from 70% of Americans being locally affiliated with a religious entity in 1999 to only 47% in 2021. But that is the direction things are going. Does it mean the demise of the church, the demise of organized religion? No, because our species needs religion. But as Wilson discovered, the key social unit is, in fact, the tribe. And then his second Pulitzer Prize was in identifying that there are 9 tribal species. Now, 8 of these 9 species have evolved as one might expect. An enemy comes into the camp, the tribe unites, defeats the enemy, some members of the tribe die, but life goes on for the tribe. And so the tribe survives. He says, unfortunately, the 9th tribal species, and he calls these eusocial species, EUSOCIAL, the 9th eusocial species has evolved to believe an enemy is necessary for the tribe to survive. And where no natural enemy exists, they create one. And Wilson says, we don't get a hold of that, we lose the species and we lose the planet. as we know it. That's not in any of his books. The best place to hear that is on a Terry Gross interview on Fresh Air a couple of years before his death, which took place last year. But that is the problem. We create enemies that don't exist. And if you know the work of René Girard, the anthropologist philosopher, usually it's top down, as those in power determine that the best way to remain in power is to identify enemies in the camp that only they have the unique ability to identify. And then that will always be a minority group that is virtually powerless. And of course, the most egregious example of it in the 20th century would have been the Third Reich with the Jewish population. And today in the United States, it's trans people. So we're only 0.58% of the population. Unfortunately, right now, the LGBT part of that world, after marriage equality, is seeing the numbers go in the right direction for them. And so a lot of them have unfortunately abandoned us. Because they see that it's moving in the wrong direction for trans people. And it is, and it's not good. It is not a safe time to be transgender in America today.
Well, hold on. I'm going to show you something. Just reading a book by a friend of mine, Theology of Consent, Mimetic Theory in an Open and Relational Universe.
There you go.
And he's doing I just read the chapter on scapegoating.
Right. Yeah, that's René Girard. Mimetic theory is what Girard is known for.
Literally just read that this morning.
And that is that's how those in power have remained in power. I alone am the one to identify the enemies within the camp, and so you better leave me in power because I'm the only one who can identify those and eradicate them from the camp. So whether that's certain people running for elected office now, or whether that's Hitler, that is always a red flag.
Yeah. And then one of the trans man that I interviewed that is a hip hop artist. He lives in Chicago, and he was sharing how hard it's been for him to gain acceptance in the LGBTQ community as a trans man. And then I have trans people in my church, and it's been interesting that there's been some issues within the LGBTQ plus community and some discrimination toward the trans there as well. So that's what you're describing, is that not only is it the straight cisgender community that's like doubling down against the trans community, but there is a little bit of that even within the LGBTQ plus community. Is that
fundamentalism is fundamentalism wherever you find it, and so there are fundamentalist feminists, and those have been given the acronym TERFs for trans exclusion, radical feminists who are convinced that trans women are a plague on the earth. They're very strong in certain universities. They're very strong right now in certain parts of the United Kingdom. You also discover that the segments of the gay population, particularly the lesbian population, have not looked favorably on trans men. Some segments of it. Some segments of the white gay male population haven't looked favorably on trans women. But the numbers within those communities who are in opposition to one another are very small. It's just that those who are on the other side of the equation want to try to point that out, to show division within the ranks and to point out the supposed lack of health within the LGBTQIA community. And again, fundamentalism is fundamentalism wherever you find it. On the whole, pretty much everybody within that community is supportive of everyone else within that community. Though there are complexities there that we don't have time to go into here. I would suggest reading Yasha Monk, M-O-U-N-K, Yasha Monk's book, The Identity Trap, where he talks about some of the excesses of third wave anti-racism and the far left at this point, and ways in which they can be their own worst enemies on some issues like cultural appropriation or cancel culture. I have experienced cancel culture from the left because of positions I have taken regarding medical care for teenage transgender children, which is not acceptable to the left.
You're advocating for waiting until the brain develops more fully, or
correct. Right, because we know that 0.58% of the population historically have been transgender, 1 in every 200 people. And suddenly you have up to 5% of the population identifying as transgender. And the question that you want to ask is, at what point do they identify as transgender? If you find someone who was identified male at birth, who consistently, persistently says that they're in the wrong body from the time they can first speak, that is a trans person. And that person can receive medical treatment really as early as you want to give it. 100% of the time, they're not going to detransition. 75% of those people were identified male at birth. 25% of those people were identified female at birth. And so when I say identified male at birth, that's trans women. Identified female at birth, that's trans men. So that group that identifies very, very early, yes, we do know that they can be treated very early, 12, 13. But when a child does not identify as transgender or as non-binary until 12 or 13, there are a lot of questions to ask. Is this a maturational issue? Is this an individuation issue? Is this a differentiation issue? Or is this a gender identity issue? And we're seeing in some environments up to 9 to 10% of those children who do transition, detransition. Well, historically speaking, 96% of the trans population is happy in their new gender. Only 4% are not, and even fewer percent detransition. So if all of a sudden you see detransition rates going from almost nothing to being a very high percentage of those identifying as transgender, that's something you need to pay attention to. And the question you want to ask is, when a child doesn't identify as transgender until 12 or 13, are they? Are they truly transgender? And I believe that treating those people medically with anything that is not reversible is not responsible. And again, this is for those who only begin to identify at the teen years. Also, interestingly, over 2/3 of those were identified female at birth. And almost all have comorbidities, which means have multiple diagnoses in the DSM-5. And so Europe has been looking at that, where it's not a big issue. It's not become a political issue in Europe. And Europe has been pulling back from providing medical care for these young people until age 18 without a huge outcry for the most part. Just recognizing, oh, wait a minute, this could be a cultural phenomenon that in one generation might have caused a child to be goth, and in a current generation causes them to identify as non-binary or as transgender. And the problem with that is, if you're dealing with a person who truly is transgender, well, now you've really created a more difficult environment for them to be able to transition within. And when you see this high number detransitioning, you give those who are opposed to all trans people ammunition, saying, see. And the truth is, we need to separate out which groups we're talking about.
Yeah, fascinating.
And what I just said is not well received by the far left.
Yeah, you've been canceled.
I have been canceled.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. In your book, I think you mentioned because I mentioned about, literally I knew a friend who just within the last year preached about the statistics about suicide, right? And blaming it on this thing. What you cited that when a person has a supporting family structure, community structure around their transition, that the suicide rates almost go away, right? But if they're in a shame,
we do have a 41% suicide attempt rate in the trans population, 6 times higher than any other diagnosis in the DSM-5. So that's a reality. We also know that within 2 years of transitioning, 35% of transgender people post-transition will have suicidal ideation. That's a high number. That's different than suicide attempts. However, ideation is not the same as attempts. And so we want to isolate then, what is that about? And the most recent study came out has just come out tentatively. It's a 2022 study of, I believe, over 20,000 people who identify as transgender or gender non-binary. And looking at that group, 96% are happy in their new genders. So then, well, let's isolate the 4% who are not. And we find out that of the 4% who are not, and now that's our control group. So now that's 100%. Out of that 4% who are not, if you take a look at 100 of those people, 96 of those 100 are actually happy in their new body. Only 4 are not. So 4% of 4% are not happy in their new body, almost infinitesimal. Mm-hmm. So what about the other 96 that regret transitioning out of that 100, the 100 that is 4%, if you're following the math there? So again, this is a very small segment of the population, but now we're just studying that segment. Mm-hmm. So 96 out of 100 of those, if you ask them, why do you regret transitioning? It is because of the opposition they have received culturally. It is because of the hate they receive on a regular basis. It is because of all the anti-transgender laws. So in fact, the very person preaching that sermon is the cause of the suicidal ideation. Yes, it is the internalization of the transphobia. If you allow those people to be in a supportive environment, they do not experience suicidal ideation. Yeah. So it is purely the opposition. So that, of course, is infuriating when I see or read that, because it is simply not true unless you're dealing with that 4% of the 4%. Right. So, you're dealing with a very, very tiny portion of those who transition, who regret it because they don't like their new gender. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it infuriates me too. Yeah.
Well, people are dying because of it.
Yes.
And yet, one of the problems we have in the current world is that we don't acknowledge that humans always care more about belonging than we do about the truth. And, you know this if you're a therapist, because you have clients who've been abused by their father. They say, well, I'm going to confront my father, and I know the family's aware of the abuse. They're going to back me up. And, you as a therapist have to be the one to say to them, oh, yeah, don't be so sure of that. Because most of the time, unfortunately, I think 90% of the time, the family will not back up the person who's confronting the perpetrator, even though they know good and well it happened, because belonging is more important to those people than the truth. And you see that so often, both with the left and the right. It's a human tendency to care more about belonging than we do about the truth. It takes a courageous person to actually want to look at the facts.
Yeah.
Whether you're looking at the facts of the number of teens who detransition, which is something the left doesn't want to look at, or whether you want to look at the number who actually regret their new body, which is something the right doesn't actually want to look at. It takes a lot of dedication to actually look at the facts.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so true. So, so you're still, are you pastoring or co-pastoring?
I did pastor a church for 6 years, just stopped doing that last November. So yeah.
Last November. So when you went through the rejection of the evangelical community, instantaneously, did you ever question God or like your belief in God, or did you feel like an atheist, or I know you talk a little bit about how your faith, you still call yourself a Christian, right?
I do.
Explain how your faith has changed a little bit through this.
I've gone on record. I mean, it's in my second TED Talk. I have the line, I believe in God most days, except for Tuesdays and Thursdays and any day that I'm on the New Jersey Turnpike. So to me, faith has always been something that's tentative. I see lots and lots of signals that we are randomly here on a capricious universe that does not care. And yet I also, when the day is done, believe in a benevolent creator. And that has stayed true. I also am a Christian. I actually believe in the teaching of Jesus to love God, love neighbor, and love self. And that stays consistent with me, even though I'm fully cognizant of and sensitive to those who only see the negative side of religion and do not believe in the existence of God. No, my faith continues. I don't believe that any form of of fundamentalism in the three desert religions is good for our species. The three desert religions, Abrahamic religions, all began as religions of scarcity, and in their desert forms, or in their fundamentalist forms, remain religions of scarcity. And so if you're looking at fundamentalist Islam or fundamentalist Judaism or fundamentalist Christianity, I believe that in the aggregate, they are more negative in their impact on our species than positive. But if you look at them in their more generous forms, I think all three of those religions are very positive for the species. As I've already said, I believe that religion on the whole is a good thing for our species because it's the one thing that causes us to come together at the tribal level for the major purpose of figuring out the meaning of life.
When my year 2019 was, due to my own decisions, my own shame around my own failure, let's say it that way. I was probably had passive suicide ideation and felt like an atheist. And I've always believed in evolution. I've just believed in like a theistic evolution, kind of thing. And always been a follower of Jesus. But, when it came down to it, I thought, well, if there isn't a God, I still see, like there's suffering and capricious, like you said, the capricious nature of suffering and evil and all these things. But at the same time, I was like, I've experienced love. I still believe in love. I've experienced beauty. I still believe in beauty. I've experienced creativity and generativity and some, flourishing. So even if there's no God, those are the things I want to press into.
What I've always said, seen in my church over and over again, is I love God. We love God, the God who burst on the scene 14 billion years ago in all of God's complexity, mystery, and ever expansiveness. And right there, I just define the Big Bang. And then I say, love God, the God who burst on the scene 14 billion years ago in all of God's complexity, mystery, and ever expansiveness, rooted in relationship and grounded in love. Rooted in relationship is based on the discoveries of quantum physics that the ultimate building blocks of the universe are not made of matter, but are made of a pattern of relationships between non-material entities. So the building blocks of the universe are relationships. And if the building blocks of the universe are relationships, then really is it that much of a stress to say that the most powerful force in the universe is love?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I say rooted in relationship and grounded in love.
No, I love that. That's where I'm at. I'm kind of, I'm a new process theology guy. Even though I was reading Whitehead and Hartshorne at 18 and 19, and, and I was a religion major in college. And
I was going to say, that's kind of early. I don't think I was reading them until probably my early 30s. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember reading it, but I had gotten saved at the Southern Baptist Youth Camp from smoking weed and all this. So I was like, well, I think I got saved. I'm pretty sure I did. So I kind of gravitated toward the more conservative, like an N.T. Wright kind of a theologian.
Sure.
But when I read Hartshorne and Whitehead, I was like, that's interesting. It's like God's evolving with everything else. That was my 19-year-old take on process theology. Now I'm diving into it with Tripp Fuller and my friend here. Yeah. And that's where I'm at. And my new favorite, I end my service on Sundays with this, my new, how you memorize thousands of verses and all that in the Bible. My one verse I've memorized in the last 5 years is 1 John 4:16. God is love. Those who live in love live in God and God lives in them. I'm like, oh, if you stick with that, you can't get too far off course.
I mean, when you take a look at discoveries of quantum physics, like you ask John Polkinghorne, who was on the team that named quantum physics. He's an Anglican cleric, also was a member of parliament and a physicist. And he, when asked how he discovered chaos theory, he said it actually was trying to understand how God can answer prayers. And so what I came up with then was the notion of chaos theory. You can hear that on a Krista Tippett recording of an interview with Polkinghorne. That this notion that, a leaf blowing in Japan can cause a tsunami halfway across the world. That it came out of that notion of how would God answer prayer without breaking the laws of nature,
and without controlling and dominating and
correct.
Yeah. It's a fast. So that's what I've been trying to get my head around, and I'm doing. So I'm also doing a 2-year training with Tara Brock and Jack Cornfield in mindfulness meditation, which comes from the Vipassana Buddhist tradition.
Right.
But I got introduced to mindful meditation and dialectical behavioral theory, DBT.
DBT is a typical treatment for borderline personality disorder, and because of that, a lot of people shy away from it. Whereas I know a lot of therapists who believe that every single college freshman in the world should be going through dialectical behavioral therapy. Yeah.
I benefited from it and IFS, internal family systems. Those are the
internal
two
family system works a lot. I'm not trained in it, but my former wife, who's still very close to and also a therapist, her therapist uses it. I know a number of therapists who do, and IFS has been very helpful to a lot of people. It was not particularly helpful to me, and which is just a reminder that different forms of therapy work for different folks.
Yeah. So let's talk. Your main topic that you talk on now around the world is on gender equality. You
gender equity.
Gender equity. I'm sorry.
Right.
And you obviously come at this from a unique perspective, right?
Yeah.
So let's close our conversation out over the next few minutes talking about gender equity. What do we need to know? What do us white cisgender straight dudes who grew up in white patriarchal privilege without even knowing it? It was just the air we breathe, right? Yeah. I would have never been. I was a shy kid, introverted, nervous. Always had to overcome all this stuff. So I thought I had to overcome all kinds of stuff. I would never have thought I was walking around with a white male privilege with the patriarchal world and all that kind of stuff. Help us white dudes out who care to listen.
Yeah. And the first two are simple, but I believe would bring huge results, particularly the first is I wish all men would assume a woman knows what she's talking about and treat her accordingly. There's a lot in that. I'd say read my book, chapter 17 and 18, if you want to take a look at the where and the what of that. The other thing I'd say related to that is stop interrupting us, because men interrupt women twice as often as they interrupt other men. But the three deeper things I'd say is the first is learn the value of deference. I think women learn deference almost as a birthright. Men see deference as weakness. And until men can see deference as a positive personality attribute, we're not ever going to get anywhere near gender equity. And how does it begin? It begins by being an ally. But that's not deference. When you're an ally of women, you are still functioning at your own direction. I will do this, I will do that, I will do the other for you. I don't believe deference begins until we move from being an ally to being an apprentice. When you become an apprentice, you are saying, what do you want me to use my power to do? How do you prefer that I use my power as a white man to bring about change in your world? So you are deferring to the leadership of a group that's oppressed. That's the beginning of deference. So I think deference I'd like to see. I think a second thing is the real value of collaboration, correction, and compromise. If you take a look at, what is it that Norway, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Taiwan, and New Zealand have in common? All 6 of those nations did extremely well through the initial phase of the coronavirus. All 6 happened to have a female head of state at the time. All of them were willing to look at their health departments not as subordinates, but as equals to them when it came to this task. So they worked collaboratively with those departments. They were willing to compromise. They had great ego strength, not much ego need. And they also were open to correction. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand was particularly adept at this. If she went the wrong direction, she quickly said, that didn't work, let's do this instead. And then contrast that with the 3 countries that did spectacularly poorly in the first phase of the coronavirus: Brazil, the United States, and Great Britain. And I don't think you need to say anymore. Men have a very difficult time with those 3 values: correction, collaboration, and compromise. And the third thing I would say to men is truly, deeply listen. Men just are not taught to listen. And I kept a handful of clients when I transitioned, very much a surprise to me because most were evangelicals who stayed. But I kept a handful of clients, and when one left, when her work was over, on the last day, she said, I just feel like I need to say you're a better therapist as a woman than you were as a man. And I said, well, interesting, because I probably feel like I'm a better preacher as a woman than as a man. And I think I know the reasons for that. But why do you think I'm a better therapist? And she said, because you listen better. You don't speak as quickly. And I knew it was true. You just learn that as a woman. I was part of it because it's forced on you. And you aren't given that many opportunities to speak. But I wish I had learned to deeply listen more. So those are the things I would say to men. There's also things I would say to women, by the way. And the biggest I would say to women is learn to empower one another. Men do empower one another. Women do not. They see each other as competition. And it's a problem. I was interviewed by the Washington Post a couple of years ago. And the reporter asked me about that, and she said, well, that's not my experience. My experience is women do empower one another. And it was a 2-day interview. The first day was talking. The second day was the photography. And I came back the second day, and she said, I have to apologize to you. She said, I was talking to Madeleine Albright last night, as one does, I suppose. And she said, I was telling her what you said. And she said, oh, I agree with Paula. Don't you remember all the times I've said publicly there's a special place in hell reserved for women who do not empower one another? That's probably been my biggest surprise as a woman is how much women see each other as competition, which is interesting because paradoxically, they also work more collaboratively with one another. But both of those things are true. So yeah, there are things that I would say to both. I would also say to women, own what you know and stop apologizing for yourselves. You don't have to apologize for being right.
Give those 3 C's again. I don't know if you...
Compromise, collaboration, and correction. Yeah.
And you
women
feel like...
will do those things far more intuitively than men, particularly men with great ego need and a weak ego structure. That's great ego need equals a weak ego structure. A great ego strength is a strong ego structure. So great ego strength is a good thing. Great ego need is not a healthy thing.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't just the workplace, but it's marriages too. I was interviewing Tina Shermer Sellers the other day.
Yeah, Tina's great.
Weeks ago, and I interviewed her twice. One on her first book, God, Sex, and Conservatorship, and then her newest one on shameless parenting.
Yeah,
and but she cited, I think, a statistic that, I think 1 in 4 women have been abused, either physically or sexually. But then she was saying in marriages, I think she said 80% of women have had sex against their will or within a marriage.
I would trust Tina's statistics on things. She's her stuff is well researched.
So you think about the male dominance as a way of, I mean, gosh, it's so ingrained in not just American history but world history, and
it is.
And men just don't. we don't get taught these that, we just
No.
absorb the air we grow up in and
Right.
have no, unless you just start listening, doing stuff like this and listening, and,
Yeah. I went through a tough time about 2 years ago, a very tough year, maybe the hardest I've ever gone through, and made a number of mistakes in that time frame. And I remember saying to my former spouse, I said, wow, apparently I'm fundamentally different as a female than I was as a male. Because, these things never happened to me when I was a guy. And she said, oh, no, you were the same. You just got a free pass when you were a powerful guy. These same flaws in your personality, they were there then. But women don't get a free pass ever. And men do, and often, therefore, are not even aware of some of their deeper flaws. What James Hollis calls our existential guilt, which is, it's worth reading his work for that.
So give me advice. How can I, as with the years I have left and the influence that I have in the world, what are some of the best practices as I lead a church, as I lead meditation groups, as I write and, try to influence people in this loving, uncontrolling love of God world that I'm trying to, embrace. What are some of the practices that you would recommend for me as we close? Because we're just about out of time. And thank you so much for your time too.
I think being open to challenge from the outside and bringing people into your life who you've given permission to confront you. I think being open to stringent self-examination, to having an eye toward your heart that is relentless and seeking out the truth even when the truth is highly unpleasant. I think those things are critically important, and yet ironically, things we're not able to do if we don't have a good sense of who we are. If we cannot love ourselves, we cannot be open to correction from the outside. And we cannot enter into stringent self-examination because we're too threatened by it. So it's a bit of a catch-22. But men are given a better chance, particularly successful white men or well-educated white men in America or anywhere in the West, have a leg up in being able to have the ego strength necessary because life is good to them, to have or better than it is to most others. So they have the strength necessary to do that. They just don't have to. When they choose to be open to stringent self-examination and open to challenge from the outside, that is a sign of incredible maturity that you see in people like George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41, or you see in Jimmy Carter. The people who are that way. You know the comedians who've dealt with that. You know that more than likely Mike Birbiglia has looked at himself in ways that maybe Dave Chappelle has not. You can see these things.
Yeah.
If you take a look at the men who are willing to look at that part of themselves. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So your book is As a Woman.
What I learned about power, sex, and the patriarchy after I transitioned. Yeah.
There we go.
Published by Simon & Schuster.
And then what's your website?
paulastonewilliams.com.
And your TED Talks, you can just Google that.
You can find those at TED.com, or you can find those pretty much anywhere on the internet. Yeah.
Anywhere. And so I want to recommend your stuff. Is there any other one or two or three books that you think white men should read? Is there another, if you're recommending a little bibliography for white men, is there a couple others other than your own work I would highly recommend, because I loved your book. So
yeah, there's a book called The Feminist Fight Club. I would recommend that. Any of the works of Joan Williams. There's a TED speaker I worked with this past fall. TED Women, a British woman. Oh, I can't think of the name of her book or her name. Oh, that's frustrating. Yeah, because her book is new and good. But yeah, those would be the first ones that I would recommend. In terms of really dealing with your stuff, I would say the Jungian analyst James Hollis, Hollis, Swamplands of the Soul, and The Middle Passage. Middle Passage was actually mentioned in Ted Lasso, and clearly is a book that had been read by their showrunners. Swamplands of the Soul, I think, is possibly the best book I've ever read.
Wow, cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and I'm grateful just to have had these moments with you. So, thanks for what you're doing out there. Yeah, thanks for being out there. Thanks for doing what you're doing, and thanks for, your resiliency is amazing. So I've been inspired.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for tuning into Spirituality Adventures, and we'll see you next time.
Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening all the way through on this episode. By the way, if you're not already a supporter, go to spiritualityadventures.com, sign up for one of our monthly supports, and you will receive our bonus content. You'll receive lots of interesting information about our guests. Many of our musicians will do special bonus songs and record a song. So I want to encourage you to do that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Be sure and subscribe. Be sure and share any of the episodes that you like. And be sure and make comments if you like them as well. This helps us get Spirituality Adventures out there to more listeners, more watchers. So whatever platform you're using, subscribe, like, share, make comments, and go to our website, sign up for our team, and be a part of the team support. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.